Hi, Bria.
Hi, Arif.
Thanks for joining me today. I'm very excited about this episode for 2024. We haven't been filming many videos because we got so busy last year, but we have a new addition to our team, and I'm so excited to pick her brain about leasing. There's a lot of rental projects going up in Calgary, so it's buzzing here. It's super busy, even in Edmonton. So I'm going to pick your brain today.
I can't wait.
You're going to share some knowledge and love to, developers out there, tenants, people looking, some best practice. So why don't we start off by you introducing yourself and your history?
Yeah, thanks. So I guess started in residential leasing 7 years ago. I've worked on a variety of different projects. I started up in a luxury high-rise. It was a lease-up, so brand new construction, transition to mid and stabilized communities. I've done townhomes, office conversions, and high tower acquisitions. So I've definitely seen a lot between like brand new construction, stabilized communities, and acquisitions again are quite a different product as well. So I've seen quite a bit. I've been on all sides of the leasing, world. So from the very basic like leasing ambassador, which is almost like a administrative position, to a consultant, to a team lead, and a project manager. So I've really seen all different areas of leasing within my journey.
Yeah, so briefly tell me about those positions. Like, what's an ambassador? I think there's other names for it too, but I love leasing ambassador. I think that's great. So, for anyone who wants to get in the industry, which is also important here, I think it's a pretty cool industry, and I think there's opportunities. It certainly is with our company to kind of learn like you did. But tell me kind of the different evolution of the positions.
Yeah, so a leasing ambassador, that is your kind of like frontline person. That's typically the person who is answering the phone and prospecting with different people over, email or again, phone. They are typically doing the lease administration, so application. At times, they can be doing the application review, so reference checks or processing credit checks. And those individuals typically will be doing, that back and forth communication with a prospect after they've done a tour. Then you move to a consultant, and typically a leasing consultant, or sometimes people will say leasing agent. They are the people who are actually doing the touring, so taking prospects through the building and showing all the features and benefits and actually closing the deal. Sometimes those people will do the lease signing or the lease application as well, but typically if there is a lease admin on the project, a leasing ambassador, they will do that. And then for some larger projects, you will have a leasing team lead. So think of it as like a leasing manager. They oversee almost everyone on the team, and they kind of liaise between the leasing staff on site with the ownership group or the marketing group. They kind of make sure the project is running smoothly and that they're hitting the numbers that they have as a goal.
Excellent. Just to clarify, what's the difference between a leasing lead to lease leasing service and property management? Because I know there are a lot of property management companies out there that do the leasing component, so lead to lease, but then after that's complete, then there's renewals and just kind of keeping the building stabilized. What's the difference between those two entities?
Yeah, for sure. So property management, in some cases, some builders and ownership groups will choose to just have on property management. So that means that typically the property manager or maybe their admin staff are running all components of the building. Typically in smaller properties, that is the setup because they don't necessarily need to have staff onboarded unless there's a specific goal or it's a lease up. Property management groups typically would oversee, like there's be building maintenance, they would be functioned to do all the leasing, they do all the administration. Oftentimes in those situations you could see like a live-in building manager, and that typically tells you that that's the building property manager who's doing everything. Whereas with a leasing group, so third-party leasing or a leasing group that's hired by the ownership group, they're coming in specifically to do the first interactions with the tenant, so lead to lease. At that point, there's the tenant handover, and really after a tenant or resident moves in, that leasing team doesn't really interact with the day-to-day challenges or questions that a resident would have.
Yeah, so Cityblock, we've chosen not to do property management. I think that's a specialized skill set, and I think there's a reason why we did that. There's been many examples sometimes with if it's a larger building and they have the capacity to work with a separate PM and a leasing company, that's kind of what we advise, because I do feel that a property management company that's true a property management companies, they've got really good skills in that. And then a leasing company, it's a different skill set. So having best of both worlds for the owner of the property is kind of, in my opinion, is kind of the path going forward. What are some downfalls that could occur when it's an all-in-one PM doing also leasing and the marketing?
Yeah, I think for those type of roles, sometimes where things get a little bit in the weeds is when there are, tenants living in a building. Those residents have obviously accounts and payments they need to uphold. There is often a lot of times, filings that have to be done, or different types of paperwork to mitigate some of that risk. So sometimes what can happen is if the person who's responsible to manage all of the tenants, accounts and how every tenant is doing and all the maintenance requests and all of those things, you don't necessarily get the same type of service from a prospect experience. For smaller buildings or stabilized properties, that necessarily isn't a factor or an issue because they're probably turning over just a few units a month. So it's not going to require as much demand. But for some of those higher term properties or new lease-up properties, it's just a matter of how much function can one person or two people have to achieve every single goal that you have when it comes to a lease-up. I think having the separation between the two groups also really helps, structure the property, because everyone knows their lane and they're good at their lane and everyone is responsible for their goal. From a leasing perspective, you fill the building. Obviously, property management and leasing need to have a strong relationship in order to be successful. But once that tenant handover happens, that property management group, they know exactly what they need to do to get the tenant moved in and to get them, from A to Z in their life cycle of living at the property.
Absolutely. One thing I wanted to touch on in there is kind of that specialization, and in leasing, at least with our firm, we still believe that customer journey or tenant journey is extremely important. So we don't generally rely on an online sales model where there's either a bot or a call center or something that's filling a building. We still believe boots on the ground, walking people through units, understanding about how they live is important. And especially with net migration, people coming from Ontario and BC, living in a rental apartment is normal, and it's actually how most people live in those areas. And now they're coming to Alberta, and I think at one time Alberta was kind of saw rental as a lower way of living, but that's changing. So these aren't heads in beds; these are homes for people, and we want them to stay at the properties for years, not transition. Because for the property owner, that's a little bit of a headache. But can you talk about the philosophy of still walking people through, still having agents in a leasing office on site with show suites? What does that look like?
100%. Post-COVID, I think there was a huge shift into technology, right? And people, if they have the choice, they don't want to go into a leasing center. Now we're seeing it almost swing the other way, where people actually want to interact with each other and they want some hand-holding, because right now the market is so unknown. Things are, quite expensive, and incentives aren't necessarily abundant anymore. So people, they want us to make their decision for them, and having someone on the ground to be able to handhold in that sense is really important for the tenant experience, but also for those people who want that. On the other hand, I think having, almost dual capability, I think you run into issues where you're fully integrated with a bot or online. I think that can pose a lot of risks from a lease-up perspective. But having, touches of integration to make the process as easy as possible, whether someone's sitting in the office with you or they're in their living room at home, I think is really important. I don't foresee a time in the near future where people in offices will become obsolete.
Right. What are some key things that a lease-up company should be asking tenants? Like, are there some, as opposed to just showing them through a unit and just standing there and letting them look at a unit and not really getting involved, what are some key questions that are important to make sure you're aligning that building or that unit to the person or people?
Totally. I think my philosophy with, leasing and sales agents or leasing agents in general is you are the painter for their life, right? Like, they are coming to you and they have challenges or this lifestyle request, or, they want to save money, or they need to be closer to a partner, or they are commuting and they want to cut that back. You have to understand their life on a deep level, not personally necessarily. Some people will share with you a lot more than maybe you were expecting to get, but you need to tailor your presentation to suit their needs. And in this type of a market where supply is not necessarily abundant, but people are being so cautious when it comes to making a decision, they need to walk away saying to themselves, that person was A, so helpful, but B, this property, this is a no-brainer for me. My experience with individuals who don't have a tailored approach, like, it's a very cold and sterile environment to open a door and say, have a look around.
Yeah.
Like, I think we're past that. Now, as you mentioned, rental is almost more like a real estate endeavor. Like, this is a choice. It's someone's home. Like, this is not a small decision for them to make. And I think successful leasing agents bring that thought process with them when they come to tour with their prospect.
I agree. And it's really interesting. So I spent all of last year and a little bit of 2022 just going out and talking to developers. And there's this mad rush to, you drive in Calgary right now and there's cranes everywhere. And the majority of them are purpose-built rental. Even Edmonton is tracking internally, but also on, like, along the Hyundai on the outskirts, right? It's a different market there. But in Calgary, I do find that with that, the news and all this information coming in with net migration, and those numbers are very high, developers are thinking that they don't really need to think about those things, the high-touch experience, having a leasing office, doing the marketing. I think it's a little bit short-sighted in doing that. And now into 2024, I am now getting feedback from 23 of some developers saying we made a mistake. And now you have a building that's like semi-occupied and you're asking for marketing, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. I always say stay consistent and steady in your development, have a component of marketing, and also bring in really good agents or specialists to lease it up, because there's performance that have to be considered, and the absorption schedule, a lot of them are getting extended right now because these were oversights. How important is marketing, either a pre-lease, the pre-lease component, and then once the building is live, all those things, the lead up to a building, how important is that?
Well, I think when we think about someone's decision to leave the home that they're currently in, people are getting information typically from their landlords, call it like 60 days out from the end of their lease. So prior to that date, individuals are thinking about the coming up of their lease. So, when they're driving around, it's really important that we have effective marketing out to educate them about what's coming. And it's also really important that we maintain our presence throughout an entire life cycle of a building, because as a tenant goes through a 12-month cycle, they're going to potentially be moving out. So if we're not top of mind, or we're losing that, connection to our community, the next residents who are going to be coming in, they're not going to know who we are, and they are going to go to the competitor. Right. So really keeping your marketing presence from, call it pre-lease, pre-lease, throughout the entire tenure of your building is so important, because you never want to be the last choice, or you never want to be forgotten about.
back to the tenants, can we give them some tips when they're out there? There's, you know,
Yes.
there's a lot of buildings, some are coming up at the same time. You can literally walk down the block and window shop.
Mm-hmm.
And it can get overwhelming.
Absolutely.
Right? And to some people, it's like a building's a building, a building's a building. It's not, I disagree. Certain buildings have certain amenities, etc. All these kinds of things. So from a tenant's perspective, what kind of questions should they ask when they're being toured?
Yeah, great question. I think that before you start touring, I think getting an understanding of what are your requirements from, you know, your lifestyle. Do you need to be in a certain geographical area? Are you okay with the price points of that area? If you are, perfect. I think when it comes time to making your tour, I think be very aware of how the person on the line, when you're booking your appointment or they're confirming your appointment, how are they speaking to you? I think that tells a lot about just overall the building itself, and the type of care you'll get as a resident. So pay close attention to that. I think when it comes to looking at an apartment, ask about all of the features. Like, are there, you know, areas, amenities that have, you know, deposits that are required to be used, or are there pet restrictions? Just because maybe you don't have a dog right now, maybe in the future you'll get a dog. So think forward as well, and make a decision that aligns with you in this state of your life, but also moving forward. I think when it comes to lease signing, something that can happen, and I see this a lot with private landlords, especially in this type of a landscape, a lot more private landlords are popping up. And this is not a blanket statement against private landlords. There are many that are amazing, but there's also a lot that don't have the necessary mindset or awareness of the regulations to be renting a unit. And I think sometimes people think moving with a private landlord is better for them than renting with a property management company. I think that if you're choosing to rent privately, I think really get an understanding of what does your landlord know? Do they have experience with the Residential Tenancy Act? Is this what they follow? Is this their first time doing this? Because when it comes to maintenance or questions, you need to know that your landlord is going to support you and they are knowledgeable in what they're doing. And also when it comes to leaving a lease, for anyone, whether you're renting property management or private, be really clear as to what your penalties are and ask those questions. How can you get out of the lease? What is the cost to do so? What are those, you know, options that you have if you do need to leave your lease? Because no one wants to, but it can happen.
Right.
And I just think knowing that up front can, you know, help you if that ever happens in the future. But in general, I think when people are going out to lease an apartment, this is a decision that you shouldn't take lightly. It's important. Check the safety of the area, make sure that you're comfortable. How's the garage look? Where's your car going to be parked? Like things like that, like think big picture. I think it's easy to get, you know, drawn in by really attractive amenities. But if you're really compromising space or, you know, functionality, maybe that's not the best for you. So look at a few different places, take note of the people who you interact with, and just make a long-term decision.
Yeah, and also some of the programs that a building offers is, you know, community. So again, because these are going to be homes for people, we're seeing some of the higher end buildings really zero in on a sense of community. So they bring in like some really cool things like a chef or flower making.
Yeah, like fitness classes.
Fitness classes, like that's so cool. So to your point, are those things important to you, right? And you know, the rents will probably reflect that, but it's a lifestyle. And the other thing I was thinking about moving forward is if the building isn't walkable or downtown where it's easy to access other amenities, and say you're on the suburbs or wherever else in the city, you know, EV stations, like electric vehicles are not they're not stopping, right?
No,
so it's like,
sure.
How is that building considering those kinds of things, right?
I think it comes down to lifestyle, right? Like I think while for some people amenities are super important and having that community aspect is so important, I think if you're a single young person, amazing, that's a great option. If for you, you know, you are a doctor and you work night shift and you're never around during the day, like does it make sense, unless it's location based, for you to have this platform of amenities? it really boils down to what is that person's lifestyle factor that they really want to uphold.
Right.
For a lot of people, this is their first time renting, and it's
Right.
so exciting, and it can be really overwhelming to narrow in on what you want. You know, the benefit of leasing is that this is not a long-term permanent solution. So if you rent, you can move. It's not the end of the world, obviously. For a lot of people, it's, you know, not the greatest decision to have to move too frequently, but that's the benefit of leasing. When we think about comparing it to home ownership, there used to be a stigma that owning a home, you know, was the most important thing at, you know, a certain age for a lot of people, and for a lot of people right now it's not attainable.
Right.
So I think for these people who are entering the market to lease first time, or because their life situation has changed, I think you just really have to make a decision you feel comfortable with, that you know, there's more benefit to con.
Awesome. The other thing I wanted to bring up was on the leasing side, it kind of goes two ways. You don't want to set up the property management company with a poor leasing process, right? I've seen in history, I've seen back pocket deals being done just because the leasing company or individuals, you know, want to kind of collect that fee because they know they're going away. And then a year comes up, or things were promised that are not being delivered because it shouldn't have been promised. Have you seen this in market as well, where that can happen, and that I think owners or developers should be weary about that kind of conduct?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I have seen it happen quite a lot. And, you know, to go back to property management, again, not all property management is bad, but oftentimes once a resident moves in, there are a lot of promises made from the property management group because they don't necessarily know from a leasing perspective what next year is going to look like. So they can't promise what your renewal is going to look like. And I've seen that happen a lot. So I think, again, everyone staying in their own lane is really important for that reason. But I have seen it where leasing agents will, you know, up rates maybe that aren't necessarily reflective on a rent roll, or you know, there are incentives in market and they aren't being offered to everyone because someone gets a read on how a certain prospect is and maybe what their financial situation is. I think sometimes what can happen, and it's really unfortunate with students, international students specifically, is sometimes because of the requirements that different management groups have, those individuals are really put through a more stringent, I guess, microscope, and asked for things that, you know, a regular renter wouldn't ask for. Sometimes it is necessary if someone doesn't have, you know, their visa or proof of education, things like that. But I just think it's best practice always to have your standard of approval. You're looking for this type of a credit score, this type of employment reference. These are the things that are non-negotiables, and stick to that. Because you never want to be in a situation where someone feels like you judged them and did or did not approve them based on their background, their financial situation. We have to be very clear with what our, you know, guidelines are, and when we're approving applications, stick within those guidelines. And same with incentives. This is the menu of incentives that we have. This is what we stick to. I do not think that going outside of those guidelines is advisable. You never want to have a bad tenant experience. And what people sometimes forget is residents talk. So someone moves in 1 month, you know, 2 months from now they realize that they didn't actually receive anything they should have, or their rent is way different than, you know, their friend next door who's in the same unit on the same floor. And I think that's a really important thing for, you know, ownership groups or leasing and property management groups to remember too.
Awesome. So we like to get involved in a project if we can, right from, you know, really down to like the drawings, architects being involved. Some of the funding companies will pull us in early stages. Ideally, that's when we like to get involved. So from planning a building and sitting with architects, why is it valuable to have a team like ours involved at that point?
Yeah, 100%.
Without, like, we obviously don't take over the
I will
the,
redo
the,
all of your
the
architectural
initiatives.
drawings.
Yeah, no, like,
I
but
think
it's
just
just
from
collaborating.
advisory.
Yeah, exactly, collaborating. Because at the end of the day, we have to lease these units, and we want that building to be represented and livable.
For sure.
So.
I think from looking at drawings, if we're brought in at that stage, things that can sometimes be overlooked is moving in. Can someone's truck fit where you expect your moving alley to be? Where's the garbage? Where's parking? Where is there storage? What are the logistics of the building to get into the building? From that stage, it's really important because those things do affect the tenant experience, especially move-in. How easy is it for them to actually get their things here, right? When we think about rent and incentives, that is a really important piece, if possible, because there's a lot of factors that come into pricing a building. And I think the more of a specific and tailored approach you take, the better your result. When I think about, pricing projects, when you are looking at it from a macro level, you may expect that certain units are going to be relative in cost. But actually, when you get into the building and you look out the window, there's a huge cement wall, or it's very dark, and you forgot to take that into consideration, or it wasn't possible to take into consideration. I think having that sort of feedback is helpful. I also think, depending on where we're brought in at, some building construction that can be adjusted. Doors, that is a huge thing I see. Swinging doors.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of attention thought about doors because they affect furniture, and if someone can't move their furniture in, that's a problem. So just thinking about little things from a functionality perspective and storage, pricing, the views, having a third eye. For a lot of developers, they maybe haven't done the on-the-ground leasing, so they don't have that feedback that, I've probably heard a million times, like certain pieces of feedback that can really affect that experience. I think having us brought in to, just kind of suss out what they're doing and any suggestions, I think is helpful. And, there's a lot of other things that sometimes aren't taken into consideration, like elevators.
Yeah, elevators is a big one.
Pre-construction, right? Like we
Yeah.
have to think about, if we are doing pre-construction tours, are we showing the building when it's down to studs? Does that show well? What options do we have? Does someone have to walk up 5 flights of stairs to see the show suite? How is the show suite getting staged? Things like that from even a marketing perspective. Are we hanging banners? Do we have site signage? Do we have flags? I think that sometimes those things can be overlooked, and having an experienced eye just to advise on those things can set up a developer ownership group in the right direction.
Yeah, so it's not really engaging your lease-up firm, 3 months before the building is open. It's thinking about, well, we'd like them at the table along the way to sit with the project team, which is what we do. So we'll be brought in, 6 to 8 months before, and the work back is quite extensive. It's things that a developer, they've got so much to think about. Like construction alone is weighing on everyone's minds, right? And hitting deadlines, budgets. So to have that leasing company in the background to work with them at the project level and sit with the stakeholders and anyone who's contributing to the project, I think is super valuable. So yeah, no, that's great. So just closing out, what are some technologies that we can consider when it comes to leasing? So we do love still the hand holding, boots on the ground, face to face. But there are online technologies that also contribute, right? Obviously on the inbound marketing side, there's, a ton we do there. But then that engagement with a tenant, what kind of technologies are out there? And tell me a little bit more about a CRM and why that's important.
Yeah, so, I have worked on projects where, we're using Excel.
Yeah.
And we're logging everything manually, and I think looking back on those days, a staff of 6 to complete a lease-up now could probably be done with a staff of 2. And when we think about, the supply and demand and how these buildings are starting to come online, there's going to be more need to have more accessible leasing opportunities. So using, things like, online leasing platforms, if they're built into the CRM, I think that that's a really positive feature. I think when we think about a CRM, it's not just housing that data anymore. We're using that technology in a CRM to communicate with our prospects. And these prospects do expect pretty up-to-date communication, and they want the information they want now. So whether it's having an AI bot technology to give some basic information and then pass off to a real person, or having online leasing capability to do an application online and submit application. I think right now there's a big shift that's happening, whereas before if you submit an application, the onus is on the leasing agent. If they're struggling to complete your application or to process anything, the onus was on that agent. So it does create more of manpower hours that are needed to get from A to B with an application.
Right.
Now we're finding technology is coming in and they can actually do those checks themselves. I think some people could be a little bit weary of technology, but I think it's here to stay. And I think, if we're thinking about vacancy rates in all regions, Edmonton and Calgary specifically, vacancy is at, one of the lowest percentages it's been in years. Like I think it's less than 2% across Canada. And when we think about all of these people who want to rent, we need to make it easy for them or we'll lose them.
Yes.
So I think technology has a big place here and it will stay.
Awesome. That's a lot. Thank you so much. We are super busy with the clients that we're speaking with, and continue to bringing in new clients from all over. We've got investors coming in from Toronto, from Vancouver, that don't know Alberta at all. So making sure that you align with the right, I think, experts in this is important. And we thank you for answering these questions, and hopefully our guests will reap some benefits and have them thinking. Is there anything else that I maybe didn't ask that I should have asked?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think so.
I mean,
maybe a part two.
Yeah, we could talk about we could just talk about marketing alone and that whole inbound and lead portion of lead to lease. So maybe we will do that.
Part 2 and 3.
That'll be fun. Thank you, Bria.
Thanks, Arif.